Dobry din, and that's about the extent of my Russian. So this presentation is going to be in English. I was told I have about 30 minutes, and so I will I speak very quickly, so I'll do my best to basically not speak as quickly because sometimes I'm hard to understand. And so I was actually asked to speak a little bit about how European startups, international startups can raise money in the US, and I would say Silicon Valley specifically. So sorry for the people who know who I am, but just in case for the people who do not know who I am, I'm Marvin. I'm a partner at 500 Startups. We are an early stage venture capital fund, and we run an accelerator. I actually run the accelerator, which is considered probably number 2 or number 3 in the world. And so we probably get, just to give you some stats, in the last 4.5 years, I've had about 350 companies actually go through my program in the seed stage. And because of this, I have actually a very, very large pool of seeing companies as they raise money later on, of who does well, who doesn't do well, what works, what doesn't work. And just to give you some stats also just about the accelerator program in general, we do about 2 programs a year, and we get about 3,500 applications for 30 to 40 spots. And so we are investing in the best of the best, and we're seeing how these companies actually progress afterwards from a fundraising perspective. I was an operating exec at Yahoo for many years. I worked in startup for many years. And so I've actually been in Silicon Valley now for close to 19.5 years, and I've been a VC now for 4.5 years. So US, right? Huge market. You know, I understand sort of like this idea of like, hey, we need to be in the US, we need to go there and raise money there. And it makes sense, right? Because this is actually the biggest market on the planet. And also from a venture capital perspective, you know, I would say probably the number 1 venture capital sort of like market in the world. So on many sides, from a macro perspective, it seems like it makes sense to come to the US. The problem though, this is San Francisco. We jokingly call it the Las Vegas of work, because I think a lot of people don't understand Silicon Valley. There's a lot of misnomers of Silicon Valley, because you go, hey, Silicon Valley, tech ecosystem's amazing, and there's so much money, right? It's so easy to raise money in Silicon Valley, and it is wrong. So there's a lot of money in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of freaking startups in Silicon Valley, so it's actually probably just as hard, if not harder, than Silicon Valley raising money. The other thing I'd also say is that there's very, very specific norms and etiquettes, which I'll actually talk about. And so understanding that it is not as easy as people think to go and raise money in Silicon Valley, even though there's a lot of money there. So a couple things you need to think about, right? As you are thinking about sort of moving to the US and thinking about raising money and what a VC sort of looks for in the US, the market has to be big, right? So generally speaking, as a VC, just to understand how the VC works, is that in a portfolio of 20 to 30 companies, every company has to have the opportunity to return the fund. And so if you are not focusing on, you know, and let me explain why this is the case. The reason for this is because the death rate of startups is so high, so I only expect for every 10 investments that I make, 1 is going to do very, very, very well. And the reason that does very, very well is because they're in a huge market, right? So the death rate is very, very high, and the return needs to be like 50x, 100x. That's the only way I can make money from my fund. And so we can go into a little bit more detail later on about sort of VC funds and how they work. But if you understand the economics of a VC fund, to be able to get those returns as a startup founder, if you're working on a market that is like less than $1 billion market at minimum, no VC is going to be interested, because we can only focus on opportunities where the markets are very, 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 very big. And so you need to be honest with yourself on this. Competition, right? I mentioned to you, San Francisco, Silicon Valley is US, outside of China are probably the 2 of the most competitive markets. And so one of the things I actually care a lot about when I talk to startups is, who is your competition? I want to understand who your competition is. And let me tell you, if you say that you don't have any competition, it's a bad answer for 2 reasons. Number 1, it means that every company has competition in some form. It means one thing, either if there's no competition, it means the market's actually really small and it's not that interesting. Or the second reason is that there is competition and you are an idiot and didn't do your homework. And so every business has competition. So this is one of the things you should have a good answer for and understand. Besides competition, differentiation, right? So every industry now, whatever industry you look at, there's lots and lots of competition, right? The big question for me as an investor is, why is your business better than anybody else? How are you different and substantially better? And when I say better, it's not like, well, you know, I have this product and the main competitor is like this, Google, right? And we have a search engine that's 5% better than Google. That's a crappy answer. I don't care. I'm looking for a search engine that's 100x better than Google. And so it has to be substantially better. Product to market fit, right? How close are you to product to market fit in your business? You know, and so let me explain what product to market fit is. Product to market fit is basically when in the first couple years, truth of the matter is it takes many years to figure this out. When you launch something, it is very, very rare for a company to basically launch and then hit like $1 million like right away. That almost never happens. Most startups, it typically takes 2 to 4 years before that actually happens. And so one of the things you want to be honest about is really understanding your metrics and really understanding how close are you to product to market fit. And and based on that, that also helps you with your fundraise. Growth and traction, right? So this is very tied in with the previous slide. Growth and traction is really important. So here's another way I think about growth and traction, right? It's numbers, it's metrics. How well are you doing in your business? How many customers do you have? Or if you're a mobile app, you're a consumer-focused business, how many users do you have? What's your growth rate? And so understand these metrics. You have to understand your metrics better than the investor. And by understanding your metrics, this is important. Growth and traction, where it's like, I might not like you, I might not like your business, but I can't argue against traction and growth. And so this is actually very, very critical these days in startups, is that if you have growth and traction and you're doing, say, $1 million a year in revenue, there's a big question that you have to ask yourself is, do I even need to sort of raise money? And the other thing that you have to ask yourself is that for growth and traction, it's like, are things working, right? And so my view that I think about is that growth and traction is a way to think about where you are in your business. And the way I think about this, and I'm not explaining this very, very well, but growth and traction means that your business is working, that the things that you're doing now are leading to good results. That's why growth and traction is important. Not for the sake of growth. There's so many ways you can actually manufacture growth in your startup, right? You can buy a lot of ads, but the problem is you actually are building something where there's very little product to market fit. You can manufacture the growth, but you have high churn rates. And so you look at, understand these metrics and how this actually works is actually good. The magic number, all right? So we care a lot about, if you're coming to the US, my view, this is based on my experience, and I tell any of my foreign startups when they come to my program, so out of those 350 companies, about a third of them are outside of the US, I tell them, I go, if you have anything less than 40% of your customer base, whether user base, 40% of your paid customer base, that is like at least 40% in the US, then you can fundraise. If you have 0 customers in the US, you will not be able to fundraise in the US. And so the magic number that I find is that a minimum of 40% of your customer base is in the US, then you are in a good position to fundraise in the US. If you do not have that, don't bother trying. The team, all right? You need to be able to explain your team really, really well. And for us, we care a lot about, let me go through this, the balanced team. I've actually done this slide many, many times. And so one of the great things of coming here to the Ukraine is that I actually don't worry. So when I talk about balanced teams, right, you talk about the hacker, the hustler, and the hipster. And so in the Ukraine, I actually don't worry about the hacker. The tech talent in this country is amazing. Frankly speaking, I think the design talent is actually getting better. The biggest issue I have for this region is actually the hustler, the business talent, the sales and marketing talent. Sales and marketing sucks here, right? And so one of the things that you have to think about, and why sales and marketing is actually really critical, is that when you're in a market, I'll use an analogy of the Apple App Store, right? In the beginning, when the Apple App Store launched, there were maybe like several thousand apps, not that many. And so back then, the way that you actually succeeded is having a great product. Do you know how many apps are in the Apple App Store now? Probably close to 2 million apps. And so the Apple App Store is representative of many different industries and vertical markets, right? Like SaaS, where you started a SaaS business like, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, there weren't that many SaaS businesses. So you just needed a great product. Now, there's in every single sector in SaaS, there's like maybe 15, 20 different sort of like competitors. And so in situations like that, having a great product is just the bare minimum you need. And so you actually need to have sales and marketing to differentiate yourself. And so in my view, in this new day and age of competition, having a strong balanced team is actually really critical. And what I've actually seen with startups in general is that it's a hard job just being a single founder. Having a balanced founder team, someone who's actually strong on the technical side, strong on the business side, and even better, strong on sort of like the design side, UX, UED design side, is actually really important because you divvy up the work. Startups are hard to begin with. And by doing this, you allow some level of specialization in the beginning, and that allows you to grow your business much faster. This is what I see with my best teams in general. The other part that we care a lot about, and because I mentioned to you, you saw all the stuff I talked about with like having like large, sort of like big markets and team being very important. The thing that I care a lot about as a VC, and if you ask any other VCs in general, this is something they care a lot about. Are you a missionary or are you a mercenary? And let me explain that, right? At the end of the day, as a VC investor, I actually only want to invest in the missionaries. Of course I want to make money, right? Like that's my job, is to find companies that can go big and actually sell for a lot of money. When I sell for a lot of money, I mean hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion, right? The difference with the mercenary is that they see an opportunity, and what I think is a problem with mercenaries, you can build a nice small business, sell it for $5 or $10 million. If you do that, a VC is going to be very, very unhappy because you're not driving returns for me. And so I think you want to be very, very thoughtful, where if your end goal is to basically go and like start a company and sell it to Google or Facebook or whatever for 20, 30, 40 million dollars, don't go talk to VC. For 2 reasons. Number one, you're being dishonest, because my view is that it doesn't make sense to sort of like raise VC money for a relatively small exit. You will make money, VC's not going to make money. He's going to be pissed. He or she's going to be pissed at you, right? So that's one problem. Second problem is that you're better off actually bootstrapping your business and not raising money and keeping that $20 to $50 million that you sell your company for. You keep all of it. And so that's one benefit of actually sort of bootstrapping. I think the other reason, that practical reason, is that as a VC, we are innately asking and digging into you as a founder to really understand what your motivations are. And so I've actually seen foreign founders, when they show up, and I ask you the trick question, what's your exit strategy? That's a trick question, by the way. You shouldn't have an exit strategy. You should be, as a missionary, this is a business you want to be working on for the next 7 to 10 years, not something you're going to flip in 2 or 3 years, all right? And I think that's the nature of sort of emerging sort of like tech ecosystems. There are not a lot of examples of these huge, massive exits. And frankly speaking, selling a business for $5 million is actually life-changing for you. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's your motivation to do a startup. You should definitely do that. But don't go and raise money, and you definitely won't be able to raise money in the US for sure. Storytelling. Storytelling is actually really important. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one. I talk a lot about this sort of everywhere else. But storytelling is actually important because you need to know your numbers. But at the end of the day, storytelling is a superpower, just like presentation skills are a superpower. Storytelling is a superpower because human beings are innately wired to take information this way. And I use the example of our cavemen and cavewomen ancestors many, many years ago. Like the way that they passed along their history and the culture was through stories. And so that's one of the dangers. If you are trying to sell your business, like pitch your business to me just with numbers, I'm innately quantitative, so I can rip apart your numbers anytime. The secret is basically telling a really, really good story, and that kind of like sidetracks. And human beings are naturally wired to absorb stories, right? Think about the difference of reading a business book, right, versus reading a nonfiction novel. The nonfiction novels are way more powerful because business books are boring, right? They're boring because they're not story-oriented. There's no plot line to it. And so the storytelling of how you present and how you pitch is actually really valuable. And I use the example, I given some version of this presentation in Kiev, I think like about a month ago, but I use the example of like Pixar, right? Like everyone loves Pixar movies, they're part of Disney. And do you know why they work really well? Is because they spend, I asked the audience, like, hey, guess like how long Pixar actually spends like on storytelling, like the actual putting the plot line together versus actually drawing, right? And so anyways, it's hard to do this with a large room, but Pixar, for all their movies, which is why all their movies are freaking awesome, is because they only spend about 20% of their time drawing. They spend 80% of the time on the characters and the plot line, on the storyline. That's why they're so good. All right, so learn storytelling. And the best way to do this, read a lot of fiction, take like acting classes. Like there's a lot of ways that you can actually learn to get good at this. And there's also tons of like online workshops and things you can do on this too. Okay. The other part, this is in line with sort of like all the previous stuff I said, your vision, right? The big thinking. Are you going after a big market? But what is your what is at the end of the day sort of like your vision and where you see the world going to be? And that's a big part of the storytelling. It's like, tell me where you think the world's going to be 10, 20 years from now, and tell me how you and your company is going to shape that. Really important, right? A lot of us, my goal is to make money, but my goal is also to invest in things that are world-changing, right? Most of the VC friends that I have, we all want to make money. Our end goal, though, is we ultimately, I know this is a cliche in Silicon Valley, but at the end of the day, most of the best founders, most of the best investors, ultimately, we want to change the world, hopefully for the better, but all of us really want to change the world. And a lot of times in early stage startups, sometimes I would just invest in a company because their vision of the world and what they're working on is just so compelling that makes me want to be part of that. And so that's part of the selling process of your vision on where the world is going. Yes, I want to see that you're going to make me money, but the biggest part actually is where is the world going and how is your company and business going to fit and actually make that world better. What I call the vision worth fighting for. And like I said, this is really, really important, right? At the end of the day, we all want to do good in the world. We want to make money, but we all want to do good. So the vision actually matters. There's a reason. I can make a lot of money investing in weapons companies. I can make a lot of money investing in drug companies and smoking, sort of tobacco. But that is not something that I would be proud about telling my family, right? And so the vision, like that, and those type of businesses produce a world that none of us want to be part of. And I actually think that's part of the reason sort of there's this utopian view in Silicon Valley. But it's because a lot of us, why you have these amazing big businesses coming out of Silicon Valley and not anywhere else, is I think because of this grand vision that actually comes out of startup founders. Not from us, but from the startup founders. Okay, now about practical stuff, right? The biggest thing is learn how to network and build relationships. This is what I see too often with like founders, right? They walk up to you, they don't even build any relationship, they pitch me right away. How effective do you think that is? Do you know how many times I get pitched a week, right? I go to these conferences and I have like 20 people right after a talk pitch me, hey, I'm doing this. Guess how many I've actually invested in? I've been doing this now for 4.5 years, right? I speak at 50, 60 conferences a year. I get pitched a lot. Do you know how many companies startups that I've actually invested in where somebody actually came to me and actually pitched me right away? The number is 0. And so learn to build relationships. Learn to think long term. Learn not to be transactional and just like sell and pitch right away. It doesn't work. People like me are guarded, right? It's like people who are like, and there's so many good-looking people. It's like a good-looking person in the bar, they get hit on all the time. You're on guard. It's the same thing as a VC, all right? So learn to develop and learn to network and build relationships over the long run. The introductions, so this is what I mentioned to you. The introductions matter. Most of the investments I've made are through introductions from other people, from people I trust, from friends of mine, from other investor friends of mine, from startups I've actually invested in. And the reason for that is because the introduction process, the etiquette in Silicon Valley, is that if somebody introduces this company to me, I will almost always take that meeting if I trust that person. Versus having somebody come cold and I don't know this person, or somebody cold emails me, the issue with that, the practical reason is that the introductions are a great way to filter. Because if I just took any meeting of some random person pitching me, if I basically just had to start like talking to just random people that ping me on Facebook or LinkedIn or email, I would be inundated. I'd be inundated with like companies and I wouldn't know how to process it. So the introductions are a way in Silicon Valley of filtering. A lot of people complain about it. It's like, this is BS. You know, this is old, you know, sort of this old boys network of introductions. It's not. The reason that I figure is like, look, think about it this way. I have close to 6,000 links on LinkedIn, probably about 4,000 contacts on Facebook, pretty active on Twitter, and I've invested in tons of companies all over the world. And if you cannot find a way to get an introduction to me, how the hell are you going to be able to get introductions to customers? Right? Think about that. It's a filter. If you cannot find a way to get to me through an introduction, you're probably a crappy founder. Okay. And the other part is you want to treat fundraising like enterprise sales, right? You have a big pipeline, right? Start with a lot of candidates, talk to a lot of different people, get introductions, and then slowly winnow it down and actually have a process. Run it like a run it like a sales and marketing process. And run it in a very, very tight timeline. And so what I find is a lot of the best people who fundraise the best are actually really good at sales, and are actually really good at enterprise sales. There's a direct correlation in general. And so the good thing is that, look, I have invested in one Ukrainian company. I know a lot of Ukrainian companies have actually sort of like raised money in Europe, raised money in the US. It is possible because at the end of the day, and one of the things that's a facet and the core tenet of 500 startups, our view is that the talent, the technical talent, the entrepreneurial talent, the quality of the companies in general are the same everywhere. The best Ukrainian founders are just as good, what I've seen, are just as good as the best founders in Silicon Valley. The only difference is the opportunities and the network that you actually have access to might not be as good as some of the folks and the opportunities we get being an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. And so our view is that it is absolutely possible for you to raise money in the US if you actually follow certain principles, learn the etiquette, and think about this as a long-term process. And the other thing I'd have to say, even though this talk is on fundraising is not success, all right? Raising VC money from an awesome VC is not success. I have lots of companies who've raised like $10 million, $20 million from a great VC and still suck and die, all right? And so the reality is that the most important metric in my view is that for success as you as an entrepreneur is that you're working on something that actually personally matters to you, number one. Number two, you're serving customers and making money off customers and solving a real problem. If you do that, that's success. Fundraising is just basically, it's a metric, right? And so somebody said this, I usually have this like quote, and I change it around a bit, right? It's like congratulating, and there's a quote in Silicon Valley, and I say that to my companies too, is that congratulating somebody for fundraising is like congratulating a chef for getting the ingredients together to cook. That's the exact same thing. It is nothing. And it does not mean that you are successful, all right? The most successful is build a freaking awesome business. The fundraising is incidental to that. And so anyways, I hope you found this presentation interesting, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Okay, Marvin, thank you very much. The Silicon Valley is a state of mind. It's my favorite quote.
It is.
Okay, I have some questions and we will pass to another speakers.
Sure.
Okay, so you're visiting Ukraine maybe twice a year, maybe one year, sure. Very often. So how can you describe Ukrainian startups? What's the problem? What's the straits?
So here's what I say about the Ukraine, right? And this is why I'm going to try to come back in July, try to come back in September, is that I see huge opportunity. I'm not just saying this for the audience sake. I'd be lying, and I'm not a liar, right? But I've seen marked difference of the Ukrainian startup ecosystem compared to, I came out a lot here in 2011, 2012, 2013, and yes, it's been like 4 or 5 years, but the quality level of the companies coming out now, way, way better than it has been in a very, very long time. You've been in the ecosystem for a long time. You don't see this difference. I do after this sort of big difference. So technical talent's very, very good. not to be underestimated, the level and quality level of ambition, much higher now. The quality level of English, much higher now. And you're like, that's a good thing, because the reality, whether you like it or not, the language of tech and the language of the tech business is English. If you are not speaking English, that means you're cutting yourself off from major sources of knowledge and expertise. And I've seen huge difference in actually Ukrainian culture, particularly just even the last while. Like, so many people speak English now. That means you get accessibility to knowledge and talent and whatnot, right? So, as I mentioned to you earlier, in the Ukrainian startup scene, technical talent is not the issue, right? Definitely think like sales and marketing, horrible, like just horrible. That's fixable. That takes time, but that's fixable. I think design talent was actually pretty good. And I would say sort of like product management is starting. And I know there's sort of a lot of like really local initiatives to sort of make that better. But I also think like everyone talks about sort of like the outsourcing business here as a bad thing, right? And I would say it's a good thing and it's a bad thing, like everything. Everything's a double-edged sword. So it's a good thing in the sense, for me, that it trains people and it makes a lot of your talent world-class because all your customers are international. And because of that, raises your level, in my opinion, raises the level of what is global standard versus, say, servicing some like local Ukrainian sort of like IT customer, right? So that's a good thing. It raises standards and it's a training ground. And my view too is that if you're working in an outsourcing company 2-3 years, I think that's a good thing. If you're working in a local sort of like IT outsourcing company for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, that's probably not a good thing. I think that you become stale and you lose a lot of your ability to sort of like look at the market. And so I think it's a great training ground for like a couple years, but then go do your startup, go build something. And so my view is that I think you have a lot of great examples now, like Riedel, MacPaw. I love the guys at Computera. Like Reply, if you look at Grammarly, like there are some really good examples of potentially big companies emerging now, and most of them bootstrap. Most of them did not raise VC money, right? And so that should give you a signal of I think, the stage and the interesting level that I think the Ukrainian startup system is.
Okay, Marvin, in terms of ecosystem, yes, we have a problem with BDSM. Yeah, I'm talking not about bondage, sadomaso, and so on, but about business development, sales, and marketing.
Sure.
What the best way to increase its ability, not for each company, but to rise level of general market, like ecosystem level? What's the best way to invite guys from abroad, or maybe jump out our guys to
So here's my view. I think it's a bit of both, right? I think it's a bit of having people, like hiring sort of outsiders, and that helps arm your company. I also think it's a matter of like cross-training, and it's a time thing, right? So having speakers, having more workshops and things like that, and having more exposure. Because here's the thing, this is what I find, is that it's, like, as I mentioned to you earlier, it's actually not a lack of mindset. I don't think it's a lack of interest either. I think it's a lack of exposure and access.
Okay, and what the 5 books you can recommend to read for Ukrainian entrepreneurs?
One of the things I'll say is just like, it's a basic book, but Lean Startup by Ries, like it's an awesome book. And the dirty secret in Silicon Valley is like, most people talk about it, but most of them have not actually read the book themselves. And so seriously, read the book and practice it. It works. I would say any of the books like on marketing in general, like any book by Sean Ellis is like really, really good. There's another one which is Traction. That's by like Justin Mares. He's a good friend of mine. Mares, and it's a great book about like sales and marketing channels. That's a great book, and I mean, there's so many awesome books. So many awesome books.
Okay, and maybe last question.
Oh, one thing I will say. Sorry, just to cut you off. The other thing is, if you're interested in learning about like a lot of like sales and marketing, if you go to 500 Startups like YouTube page, we do a lot of conferences and events focusing on sales and marketing. That's what we're very, very well known for. So go to 500 Startups and look up WMD, 500 Startups on YouTube. We have like 2 conferences that we do. It's like the Weapons of Mass Distribution, and we put all the videos actually online. And these are some of the best sales and marketing people in the world who are actually presenting their secrets. And so go to it if it's interesting. It's a great resource. The reason we make it available to everybody because we think that this is something that everybody should get better at.
Okay, and I heard 500 startups tried to expand the activities to the Europe and to other regions. Do you have any particular plans to set up offices, businesses, to hire partners?
No,
in
it
Europe?
doesn't make. I mean, it doesn't make sense for us, to be honest, because we know that we get the deal flow from here. A lot of us travel, and so my view is that we are mainly investing in this region through our main fund, and I think it's probably better.
Okay, and maybe the last question. We're trying to recommend guys to apply to different accelerator as much as possible.
Sure.
Because the negotiation with the accelerator and reviewing feedback from different accelerator, it's a big thing for
It's hugely
startups.
valuable. Hugely valuable. I mean, look, my view is just like, look, putting an application together and applying for one of the top players, us, AngelPad, YC. The actual practice of actually going in and sort of like the thought process behind actually doing the application, I actually think is helpful. And then additionally, the feedback that you get, if you get in, if you sort of become a finalist, we only provide feedback for the last 100 finalists or whatever, but it is valuable. I think the feedback that hopefully are world-class experts in this space, because we see a lot of stuff, we hope it's valuable. And so that feedback, I think, even if you don't get in, you will build a network, right? Your network starts to build because like, hey, maybe the timing wasn't right. I've had a lot of companies that have applied like 2 or 3 times before they got in, and they built a relationship over time. They kept me updated, and they made progress, and I'm like, wow, like they're doing really, really well. Like I want to invest in this company now. And so think about the long term, right? Like think about the relationship. Don't be transactional, because when you're building a startup, it's a 9 to 12 year journey. And so if you think about this in the long run, invest the time into building that long-term relationship, and you will get a lot of dividends.
Okay, and definitely
Final
question.
question. Yeah, I'm here. I'll answer any question.
From Silicon Valley point of view, how you can recognize Ukraine? So what people thinking, understanding about Ukraine?
Well, okay, I mean...
Stop. The main idea is the guy thinking that from Silicon Valley, there are no any difference between Ukraine, South Africa, Asia, and so on.
Yeah. So I mean, the truth is, most Americans don't travel, right? I mean, that's a dirty truth. Most people don't have passports. They don't even know the capital of Canada or Mexico, right? Which is next door. That's the biggest problem in the U.S. right now. They're not super worldly. So unfortunately, their idea of Europe is kind of like, oh, there's London and Paris, and they don't really see anything else. But having said that, the people that are in the know and the better VC funds, like Founders Fund, is very active, like looking at this region overall. There is a lot of interest actually in this region from a lot of like I think the smarter and cutting edge sort of funds. And like I said, Grammarly is a very significant win. There's another one that came, it's not from the Ukraine, but from like Romania, like UiPath out of Romania recently raised over $1 billion valuation. That's a very significant win for this region. So you're starting to see a lot of companies actually starting to merge from Central Eastern Europe overall. And so I think any investor, and I'd say all the European investors are looking at this region in general. I have a lot of friends who are spending time out here from London and other places like that. So there is interest. And so you should be hopeful.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
It
Thank you very much.
was really great.
Yeah.
Thank you for visiting. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much for having me. And good luck, everyone.